Okay, well, I'm going to talk today about the idea of the teacher as a researcher. This idea has been around for a very long time. In the UK, it was first formulated by Lawrence Stenhouse, who was a major curriculum developer and theorist in the 60s and the 1960s and 1970s, and was one of the leading figures in what was called the school-based curriculum reform movement. And Stenhouse argued that there cannot be any educationally worthwhile curriculum change and reform unless teachers were cast in the role of significant curriculum makers and developers at the level of their classrooms and schools. And as curriculum makers and developers, he argued they had to undertake research into how they made these changes at the level of practice in classrooms and schools. So teachers as curriculum makers and developers implied that they had to undertake research into finding ways of realizing change at the level of the classroom and the school. And of course, at this level, classrooms differ and schools differ. So teachers had to do research into the particular situations that obtained in the context of their practices. Nevertheless, Stenhouse argued that it was very important that teachers did not work in isolation from each other, but actually collaborated in effecting change at the level of the classroom and the school. So this implied that teachers as researchers were under an obligation to share case studies of their attempts to bring about change with one another across their classrooms, within their schools, and not only making these case studies available to teachers, to teacher colleagues in their schools, but making them more widely available for discussion and debate across schools and across the educational system. So that was really the significance of the idea of the teacher as a researcher, that the teacher as a researcher didn't simply implement changes that were prescribed by policymakers and government, because you could not fundamentally implement worthwhile change unless you involved the teacher as a researcher into the development of their own practice in the particular situations they confronted inside their classrooms and their schools. So that was a basic idea. Now, initially, this was not called action research, but as Stenhouse, as various projects attempted to implement this idea of the teacher as a researcher, so the term action research was coined. Now, action research makes it clear that teaching and research are not separate activities. In action research, making and creating change and developing knowledge and understanding of the practical situations in which you are trying to create change cannot be separated. They go together. Of course, this kind of research-based teaching may be more time-consuming than the traditional practice of teaching. And the traditional practice of teaching may appear to be grounded in, may appear to be less time-consuming because it is largely grounded in taken for granted common sense knowledge that is handed down to teachers as part of their induction into the practical realities of teaching and learning in classrooms and schools. But Stenhouse felt that there was no escape from the issue. It may be more time-consuming, but there was no way in which you could bring about worthwhile change in the educational system without teachers acting as researchers, trying to deepen and develop their understanding of the problems of change in the particular situations in which they operated. Now, he exemplified this idea. And I worked with him. I was a teacher in a secondary school, and I was one of the teachers that Stenhouse selected to work with him on a particular project that was called the Humanities Project. And it was an attempt to change the humanities curriculum in schools, which was regarded subjects like geography, history, religion, English literature, and English language. These subjects were regarded by many young adolescents approaching the school leaving age, were regarded as boring and major sources of disaffection. So the idea was to change the humanities projects, the humanities curriculum in schools, so that it was not a major cause of pupil disaffection from learning. And so Stenhouse redefined the humanities curriculum as the study of values and the controversial issues that were raised in the study of human values. And so he formulated an aim for the Humanities Project, which was to deepen and develop pupils' understanding of human actions and situations, and the controversial values that these raised for pupils to address during their last years of schooling. That was the aim. Now, the argument was that this aim of deepening understanding of human acts and situations and the value issues that they raised, that this aim was not best seen as a set of specific objectives of knowledge outcomes. And this is because he felt that the aim of understanding was referred to a process in which pupils deepened their understanding, but the deepening of understanding did not necessarily mean that there was an end point in this process. So he understood the aim of teaching the humanities as best seen in terms of a set of values, which he called process values, governing the way in which pupils interacted with one another and the teacher to deepen and develop their understanding. And so rather than specify a set of knowledge outcomes, which could be measured and tested, he developed what he called a process model of teaching and learning. And this process model, in the context of the humanities curriculum, took the form of a set of principles, which he called procedural principles, to govern the teaching and learning process in the classroom with young adolescents, that's 14 years plus, who were approaching the school leaving age. And first of all, he said, the first principle was that it was educationally worthwhile to actually handle controversial social issues, social, moral, and political issues in classrooms with pupils. Secondly, that in handling these issues, the teacher should not use his authority position to promote his own view. And this became known as the principle of procedural neutrality. In other words, the teacher did not promote his own biases, his own understanding of these issues, to the exclusion of an equal consideration of other points of view that were held in society. And this led to another principle, was that discussion rather than instruction should be the primary activity of teaching and learning in the classroom situation. That pupils should discuss evidence of different understandings and points of view of significant human actions and social situations, that give rise to controversy. In other words, he felt that this was justified in democratic terms, that in a democracy, the teacher should allow pupils to have equal access to alternative points of view as a basis for discussion with each other at the level of the classroom. And this implied another procedural principle, and that is that the teacher's role was to protect divergence in discussion and not to pressurize pupils to adopt a particular consensus point of view. And finally, Stenhouse argued that the teacher had a very positive role in protecting standards and quality in the classroom process, which was not simply confined to discussion, because other activities took place other than discussion. So there may even be a role for some instruction, but the argument was that the discussion was the major activity for teaching and learning of controversial issues. So, but he did see the teacher as responsible for the quality and critical standards of discussion. And this largely amounted to that the discussion should be disciplined by evidence, provided in justification for holding a particular point of view on a human act or situation. So one of the major roles of the teacher was to enable pupils to ground their particular points of view and the conclusions that they drew in the context of discussion, to ground the development of their points of view in evidence. Evidence provided by the humanities disciplines. So Stenhouse developed this process model, and he argued that, in fact, the process model could be generally applied not just to the humanities area of the curriculum, but it could apply to the teaching of particular disciplines of knowledge. His argument was that the disciplines of knowledge were governed by concepts and procedures which very often didn't result in fixed knowledge outcomes, but provided a basis for debate and discussion within a particular form of knowledge. So as an example of that, he made reference to a very famous curriculum development in the United States of America that was designed by the famous psychologist Jerome Bruner. And Bruner called it Man a Course of Study. The idea was that one could teach one could induct students into the social sciences, into the basic discipline of the social sciences by exploring the issue of what makes man human. And it was called Man a Course of Study. And the Stenhouse argued that the design of Man a Course of Study was based on certain kinds of questions, like what is human about human beings, how did they get that way, and how can they be made more so? And Bruner designed a set of procedural principles, or what he called pedagogical aims, to govern the role of the teacher in teaching the discipline of social science to elementary school students in the United States. And I'll just give you a few examples of these principles. For example, to initiate and develop in youngsters a process of question posing. And this was called the inquiry method. So to teach pupils how to inquire into these basic questions that the curriculum addressed. Secondly, to teach a research methodology where children can look for information to answer questions they have raised and use the framework developed in the course. That was a framework of concepts, like the concept of lifestyle or the concepts of learned and unlearned behavior. To help youngsters develop the ability to use a variety of first-hand sources as evidence from which to develop hypotheses and draw conclusions. To conduct classroom discussions in which youngsters learn to listen to others as well as to express their own views. To encourage children to reflect on their own experiences. To legitimize the search, that is, to give sanctions and support to open-ended discussions where definitive answers to many questions are not found. And finally, to create a new role for the teacher in which she becomes a resource rather than an authority. In other words, Man a Course of Study, its design was not based on an objectives model of curriculum planning, like so many curriculum reforms, so-called, tend to be. But it was based on what Stenhouse described as a process model, a set of principles of procedure governing the teacher's transactions with pupils in relationship to the content of learning. Now, this process model that Stenhouse developed is very strongly linked with the idea of the teacher as a researcher. In other words, the teacher's role as a researcher is not to explore what the technically most efficient and effective means are to achieving certain learning outcomes in pupils. This kind of technical idea of research as a form of instrumental reasoning about what is the best means to achieve certain predetermined ends. This was not what Stenhouse and the people that shared in the development of teacher research, teacher action research in the UK, believed in. The relationship between teacher research and the content of learning was to be defined in terms of principles of procedure. These principles of procedure specified a set of educational values for what counted as a worthwhile educational process to engage pupils in at the level of the classroom and the school. And so the research role was, how can I, as a teacher, if you like, realize in the classroom process those values that are connected with the deepening of the pupils' understanding of worthwhile curriculum content. So the idea of the teacher as a researcher was linked to the teacher researching how to realize a worthwhile educational process in classrooms and schools, as this was defined by the principles of procedure that were implied by the aim of teaching for an in-depth understanding of the subject matter. So that was the important link, if you like, between curriculum making and development and the idea of the teacher as a researcher. And this became known, this idea of teacher research became cast as teacher action research, in which action and research were two very closely connected and fused activities in the classroom. And it became known as the pragmatic tradition of teacher research. Now, that tradition has been in various ways maintained and sustained to this very day in many classrooms and schools. this pragmatic tradition of action research, which must be distinguished from the idea of teacher research as a way of discovering the most effective means for bringing about pre-specified learning outcomes which are measurable and testable. The process model was an attempt, if you like, to construct an alternative model of curriculum development to the objectives model of curriculum planning in classrooms and schools that is so favored by governments and policymakers. And I would want to argue that certainly in many countries, there is a tension, a clear tension between these two views of curriculum development and change. There is a top-down model in which policymakers specify a highly prescriptive curriculum that is intended to be measurable and testable through tests and various forms of standardized measurement. So all I want to do is to say that the idea of the teacher as a researcher, as it has been developed initially in the UK and more latterly, more to some extent in the USA and in a context of many countries now, is at tension with the notion, with an objectives model of curriculum reform that is very often promoted by governments and policymakers. And it is interesting that this tension seems to be quite sustainable over time. When you think that Stenhouse developed this idea of the teacher as an action researcher, when you think that he developed that way back in the late 1960s, these ideas are still operating within the system and providing a basis for teachers resisting a highly prescriptive national curriculum and attempting to cast themselves in the role of curriculum makers and developers at the level of their classrooms and schools. Recent attempts at teachers trying to change the curriculum as researchers in their classrooms and schools. You can find, for example, in the UK, There is a journal called the Curriculum Journal, and in November, that journal published accounts by teachers and teacher educators to implement the Stenhouse legacy, which consisted of a set of ideas about the relationship between teaching for understanding as an educational aim, the principles of procedure governing the teaching and learning process in classrooms and schools, and the teacher as a researcher. So anyway, I hope that what I have said about the relationship between educational action research and a teacher strikes a chord with many of you. Thank you for your patience in listening.